You know how sometimes you read a sentence and it just feels really direct and powerful? And other times, a sentence can feel a bit more formal or maybe even a little mysterious. Well, a lot of that comes down to a choice between two ways of building that sentence, using the active voice or the passive voice. And trust me, understanding this is a huge step in making your English sound more natural. So let's break it down together.
But hang on, before we can really get into active and passive, we need to take a quick step back. We got to look at how we build sentences in the first place. I mean, what are the basic pieces we're actually working with here? So, here's our plan for today. First up, we'll look at the basic building blocks of a sentence. Then, we'll jump into the active voice. After that, we'll explore the passive voice. And finally, we'll figure out exactly when and, more importantly, why you'd want to use it. Sound good?
All right, let's start at the very beginning. Think of a sentence like you're building something with Legos. You need a few key pieces to make it work. And in English, there are three main pieces that you'll find in almost every single sentence you make.
The first piece, and you could say it's the most important one, is the verb. The verb is the action. It's like the engine of the sentence. It tells us what is happening. Words like run, eat, think, deliver, yep, those are all verbs.
Okay, so if the verb is the action, then we need to know who or what is actually doing that action, right? Well, that's our subject. You can just think of the subject as the doer. And here's the tip. In English, this doer almost always comes right before the verb. And that brings us to our third and final piece, the object. So if the subject is the doer of the action, the object is the receiver. It's the person or thing that the action happens to. This part usually comes right after the verb. Let's put these three pieces together with a really famous example. The hare beat the tortoise. See, it's pretty simple. The hare is our subject, he's the doer. Beat is our verb, that's the action. And the tortoise is our object, he's the one receiving the action. So now we've got our three building blocks, the subject, the verb, and the object. Now, when we put them together in that exact order, subject, verb, object, we create the most common type of sentence you'll find in English. This is the classic formula you're going to see all the time. First the subject, then the verb, then the object. This really direct, clear structure, well, that's what we call the active voice. And here's the main thing to remember about the active voice. The focus is always on the subject, on the doer. The whole sentence is driven by who or what is performing that action. Let's go back to our story again. The hare beat the tortoise is a perfect active voice sentence. The subject, the hare, is right there at the front doing the action. It's clear, it's direct, and there's no confusion at all. Okay, but here's where things get really cool. We don't always have to follow that subject-verb-object formula. We can actually flip the whole sentence around to change what we're focusing on. And when we do that, we get what's called the passive voice. Just look at how the story changes here. On one side, the hare beat the tortoise. That's active. But on the other, the tortoise was beaten by the hare. It means the same thing, but it feels different, doesn't it? The focus suddenly shifts from the hare to the tortoise. Let's see how that works. So, what's the trick? Well, in the passive voice, we take the original object, in this case the tortoise, and we make it the new subject of the sentence. So the tortoise is now at the beginning. But notice, he's not actually doing anything. The action is happening to him. He's being passive. And don't worry, there's a simple recipe for this. You really just need two main things. First, you need a form of the verb to be. Words like is, are, or in our example, was. Second, you need something called the past participle of the main verb. That's usually the form that ends in ed or n, like beaten or eaten. Put those two together, and you've got a passive verb. Simple as that. Okay, so all this grammar makes sense. But it does bring up a pretty big question. If the active voice is so clear and direct, why would we even bother using the passive voice? Well, it turns out it's a really, really useful tool in some situations. There are three main times when the passive voice is actually the perfect choice. First, when you have no idea who did the action. Second, when you know who did it, but it's just not important to the story. And third, when you want to sound a little more formal and objective. Now that you know about it, you're going to start seeing the passive voice everywhere, especially on signs and in official rules. When a sign says, "Customers are asked," we don't really care who is doing the asking. The manager? The owner? It doesn't matter. The important thing is the rule. It just makes it sound polite and formal. Here's another one you might see or hear. This bus has been diverted. Again, who diverted it? The driver? The police? We don't need to know. The most important piece of information, the part that matters to us, is that the bus route has changed.
And it's also perfect when we don't know who did something, or, maybe when we don't want to blame anyone. If you come home and say, "My last piece of chocolate was eaten," the focus is totally on the sad fact that your chocolate is gone. Who did it is still a mystery.
So, there you have it. You've got the tools now. You know the difference between the active voice, which is direct and powerful, and the passive voice, which is a bit more formal and changes the focus. So here's a little challenge for you. As you go about your day-to-day, keep your eyes and ears open. Try to spot the passive voice, maybe in a news report, on a sign, or in an email. Now that you know what you're looking for, I bet you'll be surprised how often you find it. Where do you think you'll see it first?